I am frequently asked by many poker players out there, how do you know when you should call with a bluff catcher? And in today's video, I'm going to explain exactly how to go about deciding when you should call with a bluff catcher and when you should fold with a bluff catcher. So, first things first, what is bluff catching? Bluff catching is a situation where you are facing a bet, and today we're going to be discussing on the river, where you beat all of your opponent's bluffs, but you lose to all of their value hands. So, for example, on the river, you have a hand like middle pair. Your opponent bet the flop, they bet the turn, they bet the river. They're probably not value betting worse. Therefore, you lose to all of their value hands, but you do beat bluffs like busted flush draws or busted straight draws or queen high or whatever's available to bluff with. In this scenario, if your opponent is a good, strong opponent, they are trying to put you in a position to make a zero EV call, a neutral call. And you'll find that if you can choose when to bluff catch correctly and when to fold correctly, that will give you a gigantic edge on your opponents. And against players who are not the best players in the world, you will often be able to pretty reasonably determine when you should find a hero call with a bluff catcher or when you should make a somewhat big fold. It is worth noting that your hand is not a bluff catcher when it beats hands that are likely value bets from your opponent. For example, say someone raises, you call on the button with queen 9 suited, okay? Flop comes queen 7-3. They continuation bet, you call. Turn is a 6. They check, you check it behind. You could bet, but you check it behind. River is a 10. So queen 7, 3, 6, 10. If they bet the river, you have a really easy call because they could very likely value bet with a hand like a 10, like ace 10, king 10, jack 10, right? They could also value bet with pocket jacks. So in that scenario, your hand is really good and is not a bluff catcher. If your hand is a good hand, you definitely should not be bluff catching with it. But if instead you had a hand on queen 7, 3, 6, 10, like say you had 3-2 suited somehow, or ace 3, or pocket 2s, a bad pair, that would be a bluff catcher because they're not going to value bet a hand like a middle pair in that spot. So your ace high type hands and bottom pairs would be bluff catchers in that scenario. All right, here we have my bluff catching decision flowchart. Let's go through this line by line. The way it works is essentially you want most of your answers to these questions to be yes when you're going to call, and if you're going to fold, most of the answers will be no. Now, sometimes there is an overriding factor. I'll discuss that as it comes up, and we're going to go through a bunch of examples to make it really clear how to use this bluff catching decision flowchart. Before we even get to any of the questions, question number 0, am I beating any value hands? If you're beating value hands, your hand is good. It is not a bluff catcher. It's just an easy call. Everything else doesn't matter. Okay, once we've decided that we are not beating any value hands, so we actually do have a bluff catcher, now we need to ask these 4 questions. Does my opponent's range have enough obvious bluffs in it? Now, I fully realize from a GTO point of view, quite often when you do have a busted draw, you should not necessarily bet with it. But a lot of players will at least consider betting the river if they have a hand like a busted draw. So if there are a lot of busted draws available, because let's say there was a straight draw and a flush draw on the flop and turn and it all missed, in that spot your opponent's just naturally going to have a whole lot of busted draws, and people will consider bluffing those. So if there are a lot of obvious bluffs, you should be more inclined to call. If there are not a whole lot of obvious bluffs though, perhaps because all the draws came in, or perhaps because the board was incredibly uncoordinated to begin with, just to where they would not have a whole lot of draws, you should perhaps be more inclined to fold. Next, is your opponent capable of finding the right number of bluffs? A lot of players just will not bluff often enough, especially in the small and medium stakes games. When people put in a big river bet, they usually just have a good hand because they are not capable of finding the right number of bluffs. They're not going to bluff with all the random queen highs that somehow got to the river. They may not even have the junky hands in their range that should get to the river. And if that's the case, you should be more inclined to fold against them because they don't have enough bluffs in their range. Next, is my opponent capable of turning weak showdown value hands into bluffs? From a GTO point of view, again, you'll find that quite often it is right to bluff the flop with bottom pair or under pairs, and then sometimes keep bluffing them on the turn in the river. But a lot of people do not run bluffs with hands like bottom pair because they think they have some showdown value, even when they clearly do not. So if your opponent's not going to turn some showdown, or hands that seem like they have showdown value but don't, if they're not going to use those hands as bluffs, you should be more inclined to fold because, again, their range does not have enough bluffs. And if they will use those hands as bluffs, perhaps because they are a good studied player or because they're a maniac, you should be more inclined to call. Next, this last point here, it's a little bit convoluted. We'll take it slow. Does my hand unblock the most obvious bluffs? For example, let's say the board is 7-6-4-2-2. 7-6-4-2-2, okay? In that scenario, if you're facing a river bet, which cards do you not want to have in your hand when you call? Take a second, think about it. 7-6-4-2-2. Let's say you bet the flop, or they bet the flop, you call, they bet the turn, you call, they bet the river. We're deciding if we want a hero call. In that scenario, you do not especially want to have a 5 or an 8, because a 5 is an obvious straight draw on the flop, 7-6-4-2-2, right? And an 8 is an obvious gut shot straight draw. So if your opponent has a hand like King 8 suited, they'll probably bet the flop and they'll probably bet the turn, and then they'll be there with King high on the river, and they'll probably bluff it, or at least consider bluffing it. So when you have an 8 or 5 in your hand, it makes it less likely that your opponent has those busted draws because you have some of those cards in your hand, right? And so when you have those cards, you should be more inclined to fold. And when you do not have those cards, you should be more inclined to call because they make up a larger portion of your opponent's possible range. Okay? So those are the questions. And in every spot you're facing a bluff or facing a bet on the river, when you have a bluff catcher, you're going to want to go through this process. So let's go through a few examples. If you found this flowchart to be helpful, I've created many more for you, discussing all sorts of common topics that come up on a regular basis at the poker table, such as when to continuation bet, how to defend against continuation bets, and many, many more. And you can get them all for free right now at pokercoaching.com/bluffcatch. Let's say you raise to 3 big blinds preflop from the button with queen jack of diamonds and get a recreational player who is playing tightly to call from the big blind. Okay? We raise, button, big blind calls. We continuation bet 33% pot on the flop of ace 4-4, so we have a flush draw. The turn checks through on the 7, and on the river, the big blind overbets 110% pot. Okay, let's use the flowchart to decide if we should call. Might want to pause the video, take a second, think about it. You know what, while you're pausing the video, why don't you actually ask yourself, what would you do in this spot with the queen high bluff catcher on the river? Would you call or would you fold? Pause the video and write it in the comment section below. All right, are you beating any value hands? No. Does my opponent's range have enough obvious bluffs? Probably not, because they're playing tightly. And also, if you look at this flop of ace 4-4, what are the most likely hands that would want to bluff the river? Well, it's going to be busted flush draws, right? And queen jack of diamonds blocks a lot of busted flush draws, which means it's more likely they're going to be value betting. Is your opponent going to be capable of finding the right number of bluffs? Probably not, because they're playing tightly. Is your opponent going to turn a weak showdown value hand into a bluff? Probably not, right? Are they going to be bluffing with a hand like queen high? Like, probably not, right? Next, does your hand unblock the most obvious bluffs? Well, like I said, the most obvious bluffs are diamonds, which means we really, really, really do not want to have diamonds in this spot. And we do. And therefore, that is bad. So this is a terrible spot to bluff catch. So just fold, move on with your life. Example number 2. You raise the 3 big blinds preflop on the button with queen jack of diamonds, and a semi-professional player calls in the big blind. They probably play pretty well. You continuation bet 33% pot with queen jack of diamonds on king 8-7. Kind of dicey, but whatever. Your opponent calls, turn goes check, check on the 2, and on the river, 7, your opponent overbets 110% pot. How do you feel about this scenario? A lot of people just automatically put that queen jack of diamonds in the muck. I'm not so sure, though. Let's think about it. Well, are you beating any value hands? Clearly not, so we are bluff catching. Next, does your opponent's range have enough obvious bluffs? Well, on king 8-7, 2 spades, there's a whole lot of busted spade draws and a whole lot of busted straight draws. And if they did have a backdoor flush draw with a club, they turn to flush draw and they may feel like betting those on the river as well. So there are actually a whole lot of busted draws here. Next, is your opponent capable of finding the right number of bluffs? Maybe, probably. They're a semi-professional player. So they're going to look at a hand like jack high or 6 high or busted spades and think, oh, maybe I should bluff this, right? Next, will your opponent turn a weak showdown value hand into a bluff? This question is not necessarily relevant in this spot because like if they're bluffing with a 2, it's obviously not good for us, but this is a spot where I don't think very many people are going to bet with a 2. So this question is not so relevant in this scenario. Does my hand unblock the most obvious bluffs? Well, the most obvious bluffs are spades, we have no spades. Clubs, we have no clubs. Jack 10, which we do block a little. Jack 9, which we do block a little. 10-9, 9-6, and 6-5. And we don't have any of those. So this is a spot where we do not block their bluffing hands at all. So take a look at this. This is a situation where we are going to call, and we are probably going to call more than the minimum defense frequency in this scenario because this is a spot that is going to be overbluffed by a lot of people because the GTO strategy for the opponent in this scenario is not to bet with every busted draw at all. They have to give up with some draws, and a lot of people will not do that, especially if they are a little bit active and a little bit aggressive. You may say, but they bet 110% pot. Doesn't that mean they must have a good hand? You can't really read into bet sizes too much from pretty good players. Obviously, though, if you know something about your opponent, if you know they only use big bets with the nuts, well, then fold, right? If they only use big bets with bluffs, obviously call. This is a spot where you may actually lose to some of their bluffs, so you have to be a little bit careful in this spot. But if you think about it, a lot of players will not bluff hands like ace-10 of spades on the river because they can just let it go check-check. So I don't think you have to worry too much about them having ace-high or like pocket threes. I think a lot of people check those in this scenario. So this is a spot where I would call a lot. And I know it feels a little bit dicey making a call with the queen high, but if you think about the opponent's range and realize how many busted draws are available, it's just a call. So you call. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But you got to realize you're getting pot odds. You only need to be good 35-ish% of the time. And when there's a whole lot of draws available and your opponent's capable of bluffing, you're probably going to be good way more than that. Let's take a look at one more example. You raise the 3 big blinds, pre-flop, on the button with queen jack of diamonds, again, our favorite hand. Actually, it's not my favorite hand. My favorite hand is pocket aces. We have queen jack of diamonds this time, though, and an unknown player calls in the big blind. We continuation bet a 3rd pot on the flop. It goes check, check on the turn. On the river, we have a jack. We make a pair on the river, and the opponent bets 110% pot. Ugh. Should we call or should we fold? They check call our small flop bet, check, check on the turn, over bet the river. All right, let's go through the flowchart, see what it says. Well, are you beating any value hands? Probably. Because in this scenario, they are not going to put you on a whole lot of jacks. They're going to put you on a whole lot of ace highs, underpairs, unpaired hands, right? Now, you certainly could have some jacks, but this is a situation where you will beat some players' value bets in this scenario. Now, again, if your opponent literally only overbets with a king or nothing, then maybe we do have a bluff catcher. If let's just pretend like that was the case in this scenario. Against normal players, it's just an easy call. But what if we know our opponent only value bets with a king and will never value bet a worse hand? If that's the case, does the opponent's range contain enough obvious bluffs? Probably not. Is your opponent capable of finding the right number of bluffs? Probably not. Will they turn weak showdown value hands into a bluff, like a 2? Probably not. Does your hand unblock the most obvious bluffs? There really aren't very many obvious bluffs here now, are there? If that's the case, this actually might be kind of close to a fold. So if you know your opponent is very weak and very tight and very straightforward, this can easily get swayed towards a fold. But against anyone who is decent or competent or just unknown to you, you got to find a call. So that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you reference this flowchart whenever you are facing a bet and you have a bluff catcher. It's going to make your decisions way easier and also more systematic. And if you develop good, robust systems that essentially line up with the GTO strategy, and you make a point to adjust and take advantage of whatever your opponents do wrong, you're going to be way better off than if you get to the river and just guess. Good luck in your games. Have fun. If you enjoyed this video, do me a quick favor. Click the like and subscribe buttons below, and also click the notification bell. Good luck with the bluff catchers. Sometimes they're going to fail. Sometimes they're going to work. But using the flowchart, they will work more often than not.